Hi, I'm Ted Nelson. This is a backup of my keynote to the Web as Literature conference in London, in case there's some slip up with Skyping or with the video recording at the other end. Good morning from here on the east coast of the USA, and good afternoon to you there in London at the British Library. I'm coming to you from beautiful Centenary College in Hackettstown, New Jersey. There's the logo. There's their logo. Though to see its golden dome, you'll have to go to the website. I also want to thank my wife Marlene for her steadfast help and encouragement for over 20 suspenseful years. I am pleased and honored to be giving a keynote to a conference called The Web as Literature. It happens that I've been talking about electronic literature, not electronic documents, not just electronic documents, for over 50 years, and I'm glad the community is catching up. I felt alienated from the World Wide Web for these 20 years because of what it is not. But today I'm prepared to make a compromise which may interest you. We'll talk about that at the end. And most important, I want to offer a format for a flying parallel literature. I'm fighting the medium here. It turns out that on Skype, it's hard, even on Skype Premium, it's hard to switch between looking at me and looking at my slides. So I've decided to just hold up the drawings instead after all the trouble I went to scan them. Very Monty Python. Literature. What is literature? There are many senses of literature. There's the belletristic sense of literature, gossip about old-time authors and intellectuals, or what Evelyn Waugh said to Coleridge at Emma Hamilton's as overheard by Goldsmith, or whatever. The dueling diaries of Count and Countess Tolstoy, and other gossip about very smart people, as wonderfully told in Paul Johnson's book, Intellectuals. Literature can also make you want to wallow in the depths, or I should say, aerate in the heights of things like trans-neo post-deconstructionism. In which case, I recommend the meetings of the Modern Language Association, which, as I recall, were great for meeting women with big vocabularies. But we won't get into that. No, when we talk about literature, I believe in all cases that we're talking about systems of connected documents. And the issues are connection, annotation, organization, and visualization. And the web doesn't do these things very well, not showing the connections or annotations or organization or visualization of connected documents. Right now it allows only the trivial interconnection of, quote, web links, one-way jumps into the unknown. Now, there are a number of things I want to say to you, but what order to put them in is very challenging. This is the problem of writing. I see it as the same as the issue of literature, because the problems of connection, annotation, organization, and visualization are the writer's problems from the beginning, and existing software doesn't do a damn thing for these at the author level either. What the writer has to grapple with, and should have tools for inside the single unit, the book or article, is what our literary system should do for groups of documents, and the tools for that don't exist yet either. We haven't got a decent literature either at the author's level or at the collective level. I've been working on this for far too long, and once more, we're approaching a distributable. Now, the computer world is about systems of imaginary objects, imaginary constructs. And the document constructs they've created have imitated paper, imitating individual documents of paper. This to me seems very crazy. We'll get to that. What we've got is separate documents, and they're all alike. All electronic documents are alike. Each is a box of newborn characters. Okay, here they are. The quick brown fox, encased in a file and scrambled with markup. All HTML, PDF, Microsoft Word, they all work that same way. Newborn characters which don't know where they're quoted from, for example, scrambled with markup which makes them unusable for any other purpose. This to me is nuts. Now, almost nobody can hear me or understand me because they can't get out of this way of thinking. They can't get out of the way of thinking that a document has to be a box of newborn characters, virgin characters scrambled with markup. so they think I'm crazy. People think what I say is impossible because that's the way documents have to be represented. God said so! Yeah? I'd like to see chapter and verse in any holy book that says that. Similarly, Wired magazine framed me in a nasty article that is still spreading its venom, portraying me as delirious and misinformed, kept saying repeatedly that I was ignorant, the greatest insult, kept saying I and my colleagues were not computer scientists. Well, my current title, thank you, is Distinguished Professor of Computer Science at Chapman University. That's Chapman University, an exciting and inspiring place. So let's get that settled right away. I have credentials. But I believe in something else, and by challenging a paradigm, you sound crazy. So the format that I've just mentioned gives us separated documents, not connected literature. The issue is not individual documents. The issue is connected literature, because literature, I submit, is interconnected documents. And so I want to propose a new format, but I don't want to get too technical yet. There's a wonderful quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I won't try to be exact because I think it was originally in French, but something like, if you want people to build ships, don't give them wooden blueprints, but make them long for the vastness of the sea. In keeping with that idea, I won't get to the technicalities for a while. Instead, I want to show what we're missing at some length in order to persuade you, to entice you, to recruit you before I tell you how to do it. You should be able to see the connections between pages and between documents, which is the title of this talk. See the connection? Now, supposedly in the Skype demo of the official Keynote, you'll be able to see this directly, but unfortunately, I have to show it on another machine. So here we see Xanadu, a literature of visibly connected pages, visibly connected flying pages. And as we, right here at this level, we see a connection between two pages. Okay, you can't read it, but this quotes, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, and this shows its original context in the King James translation of the Bible. Now, as we step to another connection, just a moment. As we step to another connection, pages swing up. So you can follow each individual connection one by one. That's what I mean by parallel flying documents and pages. Well, Xanadu is a flight of pages in which connections are visible as lines and juxtapositions. Animation becomes part of it so as to make the relations clear, but is not strictly necessary. And we can organize larger flights of pages around them, not shown to frame one document with other documents. Unfortunately, what I've just shown you is a locked demo. We paid for a cross-platform application and instead got a demo which cannot be changed. Now, I won't go into other times we've come close. Xanadu history has been politically grim. But this has been my standard demo for some time. We're trapped in prototype hell with parallelism visible in this demo, but not transposable. We'll get to that. So the idea is parallelism in individual documents and the organization of documents with parallel parts and the organization of a larger literature showing parallelisms among parallel documents. So let's just get into a few aspects of this. Footnotes should be on the side. People argue about whether they should be at the end of a chapter or at the end of a book. Nonsense, they should be on the side. Comments should be on the side. Isn't it sickening how they have comments inserted in the document they're commenting on. That's an awful convention. Surely in a conference on literature, we want to uphold the integrity of the document as the author created it, not infest it with intrusions by random passers-by. Outlines should be parallel. Top level, next level, actual thing, actual document. We see, for example, high tech. Here, for example, is a kind of a cruddy looking diagram showing a workspace for a programmer. Here on one side are the specs, or the contents. Here's the summary of the program. Here's the actual code. Here are the comments on the program. Here are the bugs on the program, and here's the to-do list. But this has the added advantage is that you can see side by side from any one to the next, crossing the bridges of linkage and transclusion. And that is an outline practically used. Not yet working. Corresponding parts. History is parallel and connected. History is parallel and connected. What was happening in England? What was happening in France? And when the battle was joined, etc. So not only is history itself parallel connected, therefore writings about history should be parallel and connected. We should have simple ways of creating parallel coupled timelines because so many things are happening at once, but they influence each other and they're happening at the same time. We need to know these things. Parallel narratives. Different versions should be comparable in parallel. We should recognize and be able to show and represent parallelism in connections of documents. Email quotation should be parallel. I mean, this is so silly. We have these strange emails with long trailing histories of the previous, whereas you should just have the current one you're writing or reading and direct connection to what it's quoting from. Here's this little pointy deal showing a quote, another pointy deal showing a quote, going over to where it's connected, where it's coming from. And the generalization then is parallel documents. The problem is, what is the data structure? We'll get to that. So let's talk about transclusion. See, transclusion is the opposite of a link in the Xanadu. In the Xanadu world, you have two kinds of connection. Transclusion, which is a connection between two things which are the same, a quotation and its original, and links, which are connections between things which are different. So they are orthogonal. They work together, and they are represented by two different mechanisms. Origin story. Where did the Xanadu idea come from? Well, it helped that I started at the beginning, when there was no interactive software. Having seen no computer interaction, I was free to imagine it without pre-existing templates or stereotypes. Now people just think in terms of web pages, apps, tabs, pull-down menus. There are many other possibilities in the world, but I could imagine from scratch based upon all the media I had seen and loved. And immediately I thought of how to support human creativity and human freedom. So my first idea was keep every quotation connected to its source. So here's the quotation, and here is the source document, as we saw in the demo just now. That way you could have lots of quotations and not forget what they were connected to and what they meant originally. This is useful not just for study, but for publications of anthologies. As I said, it would be great for email to be able to pull content into working stuff and be able to call up what it originally meant. For lists of things to do, for God's sake, you forget what it's about. For literature and study, For anthologies, so often you want to read more, but you can't. We have to live mostly by digests and reviews, but we can't ever check except with great effort. And for simple working documents, for seeing the same notes in different contexts. So the point was to have an editing system with transclusions stored as a list of content. Here's the transclusion. And we would maintain a document as a list of source addresses pointing to the content. That means that to fulfill or render a document, we'd start at the list of content, go to a source document and bring in a piece, go to another source document and bring in another specified piece, go to the list and then the source document to bring in another specified piece, and thereby fulfilling the entire piece. So this indirect documentation is a perfectly viable alternative to all of the formats we have now. You say, wait a minute, what if you want to make a change? Very simple, you change the list. And if there's new content, first you put the new content in a stable place, give it a permanent address, and then you point to it from the list. That takes a fraction of a second. So it's not as though this is some strange, impossible mechanism. But people think it's strange and complicated. But it buys you a whole universe. And if I just stopped there, things might have been easier. Then I got a second idea. Footnote-like jumps, enacting the footnote. So you could click on an asterisk and bingo, you'd go to the source that was being referred to, or the comment that was intended, or whatever the footnote was. The question was how to reconcile these two ideas. Well, first of all, generalize the footnote, connecting different places in different documents, what we now call a link or a YARG, hyperlink, a term I don't use. But what would be the data structure that would take care of both of these, that would handle both the list, the indirect document which is stored as maintained as a list, and the links which would be somehow commingled with the indirect document. So reconciling these two ideas, getting the design right, would take until 1979. Okay, origin story 2. Why did I have the temerity to invent this stuff? Here I was, 22 years old in graduate school, or 23, and unlike most people, I said, well, we're going to build this whole universe. Well, like my heroes, Frank Lloyd Wright and Buckminster Fuller, I have to include myself in the story because it gives context as why I think differently. In the 1940s, I was a media kid, immersed in radio and movies and comic books and records and magazines and books of every kind. When the new medium of television hit the USA, I was 10, and I had a privileged position. I watched the new medium being born sitting behind my father in control rooms at NBC and CBS. He gave up his career as a wonderful actor to become a star director in live TV, back before tape, when whatever happened went out live. With that background, I was, of course, very media-oriented. In college, I became a media innovator of sorts. In the fall of 1957, when I was 20, I wrote the first rock musical. And here's the LP. Some of you may not know what LP meant. It meant long-playing record, because it would play a whole half hour rather than the 6 or 7 minutes on the old ones. So here it is, Anything and Everything, World's First Rock Musical by Ted Nelson and Dick Kaplan, my wonderful collaborator, on the Truly Zorch label. But I was prouder still of two other things I did. When I was annoyed by the pretensions of the college literary magazine, they were going to have to raise $800. I printed my own little magazine, a little magazine. You know, when they say a little magazine, they usually refer to circulation. In this case, it was a very little magazine that fit in the palm of your hand, called Nothing. when I did that when I was 18 with my roommate Len Corwin. And then here's the third issue, which I did by myself in the spring of 1957. This was nothing number 3. It was kite-shaped. And you had to rotate it as you turned the pages. And it was in 2 colors. 2 colors. And illustrations by the wonderful Swarthmore cartoonist Russ Ryan. And I think the entire printing job cost $50. I showed the mock-up to my friend Ned Pyle, the printer who worked with me, and he nodded his head and said, "Oh, that looked good." But when we put together the first actual printed one, he was astounded. Here I thought I'd done it with his approval, and in fact I'd done it entirely on my own. So I felt very, very confident in learning the technicalities required to do any new medium. Then my senior year, I shot a half-hour movie comedy called The Epiphany of Slocum Furlough. It took me years to finish, but it's now on YouTube. So here are a couple of stills from that film. The movie is a little slow and surrealistic. The lip sync is vague, which I intended to be funny, but it bothers people because even though lip sync on YouTube is frequently very vague. The Epiphany of Slocum Furlough has been called an avant-garde comedy. The Epiphany of Slocum Furlough has been called an avant-garde comedy, and it has not been much appreciated, I'm sorry to say. But I was sure I was going to be a movie director. When I graduated at the age of 22, I expected to make a low-budget feature on my own and break into Hollywood, as many have. I was astonished 4 years later when my father did exactly that. He broke into Hollywood with a low-budget film called Lilies of the Field and became a Hollywood director, which is what I had intended to do. Usually it's the son who does what his father meant to do but didn't, like writing a novel or invading Iraq. But in this case, the father did what the son hasn't managed. The other way around. So in 1960, with my background of one ambitious student movie qualifying me as a filmmaker, I saw the possibilities of the computer screen and flipped out. I started designing interactive software just as I'd been designing in other media, but we'll get to that. Lately, there have been some interesting reactions to my earlier work. A few years ago, I ran into Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation, the oldest magazine in the USA, and the soul of American liberalism since 1865. When we shook hands, he said, "Ted Nelson, not the Ted Nelson, not the Ted Nelson who published Nothing magazine." I was never happier. Then just last month, I got an email from a famous rock musician, Terry Adams, founder of the group NRBQ, who says he loves my LP from 1957. Goes to show that if you wait long enough, things may finally come around. Maybe somebody will appreciate the Epiphany of Slocum Furlough one of these days. And maybe the electronic literature I've designed and proposed all these years will at last be recognized and used. A document has a flight of pages. So how did we get here? How are electronic documents the way they are? They say that if you enjoy sausage and respect the law, you should not inquire as to how either is made. The same applies to electronic documents. People hold them in reverential regard. That's because they haven't been to the sausage factory. So let's talk about the sausage factories of electronic documents. Here in one overview slide, I'll hold it still for a minute in case you want to snapshot it. It's quite significant. We have the history of electronic documents. Oops, left and right get confused because I'm not looking at a mirror image, I'm looking at a photo image. Okay, first came structure and connection. Then structure was dumbed down over on this side, and dumbed down over on this side to paper simulation. So let's go through it. The founder of electronic documents is essentially Douglas Engelbart, the great Douglas Engelbart, one of the great men of the 20th and 21st century. He had a vision in 1945 of documents and an epiphany in 1951 of how his life could be significant in terms of augmenting human intellect. So he wrote his Augmenting Human Intellect paper in 1963. You can find that on the web. And his implementation thereafter at a lab at Stanford Research Institute, not Stanford University. At that lab, he created the NLS, or online system, which was a collaborative system for working at screens, and invented hypertext and the document link. He invented also the mouse, which Bill English built the first one of. He showed that to me in 1966. And the high point of Engelbart's work was a great demo in 1968, which was done live from, I'm not sure which venue in San Francisco, with a radio link to Stanford Research Institute, showing the new screen media he was working on, showing his links, his structures, and all interactive and all working. The whole system worked flawlessly. It was an incredible achievement. But that was the high point. He went on with his theories and tried to hold his lab together, but Xerox PARC started hiring them away in 1974, and other things happened. So the second event in the history of document structure, I'd say, was my Xanadu system, starting in 1960, based upon transclusion, and then later adding the concept of links, which were amalgamated correctly to the design in 1979 by the team of myself, Roger Gregory, Mark Miller, Stuart Green, Eric Hill, and Roland King. But that's all in the books. So that leads to the structure we're talking about today, and that's what we're still trying to implement. However, the structure got dumbed down by the Hess project at Brown University, which I unfortunately worked on, which led to other hypertext systems like Fress and note cards, and that essentially led to one-way links that we're stuck with now. Meanwhile, over on this side, we have what happened with paper simulation. You can go two ways with electronic documents. You can try to represent structure that is outside what can be represented on paper, or you can simulate paper. Well, at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, starting around 1974, they started simulating paper. They weren't the first to marry word processing to paper, but they were the ones who added fonts. They had built a snazzy little computer called the Alto that had fonts, and a word processor called Bravo was created by Charles Simoni, which allowed you to edit with fonts. Engelbart's men, Bill English, went from Engelbart's lab to Xerox PARC, and he was going to rebuild Engelbart's system at Xerox PARC on their machines, but instead he got seduced by the bad side of the force and went over to fonts. So that the Bravo system then, Simoni's Bravo system, Simoni took to Microsoft, and it became something we call now Microsoft Word. Also at PARC was another paper simulation going on. A guy named John Warnock was working out a standardizing system for printing their font-riddled documents on different printers. And this system was called Interpress. And then he went private with it and founded Adobe, where it became PostScript and PDF. And that is how we got paper simulation as people's way of thinking about electronic documents. Meanwhile, as the internet evolved, A guy named Neil Larson was the first to put one-way hypertext on the net, on the internet. He put several systems on the net, and then along came Berners-Lee with his HTML system. So this was the dumb down of hypertext. The dumb down of hypertext started with the Hess project of Brown. I'm very sorry I had anything to do with it. Which dumbed down my notion of hypertext to one-way jumps. One-way jumps. We did actually implement a form of transclusion in Hess. It was called the borrow or BRW command, which was put in by Steve Carmody, specifically at my request. I sent a note about it to Engelbart, but he was mystified, and it was never used. But the one-way jumps of Hess became the structure of other hypertext systems. So when people talk about hypertext, they're generally talking about one-way jumps, which became Frassen note cards and finally Larson systems, and finally the World Wide Web. Note that the World Wide Web is not the first hypertext system on the internet. I get this from Wikipedia's article on history of the web browser. Neil Larson should have an article about of his own, but he doesn't. But I believe that all of Larson's links were also the blind jump kind, which later caught on. Now, I like and respect Tim Berners-Lee. We've argued for hours, even though I don't like what he did. As the Christians say, hate the sin, love the sinner. So let's consider what Tim actually did. He invented the URL, or rather he created the URL as an extension of the domain name, which reached into file structures of machines around the world and reconciled the file structures of Sun and Macintosh and Windows and whatnot, MS-DOS. And he created a protocol called HTTP, and he created HTML, which was well thought, given that you only have one-way jumps and embedded markup. Now, what Tim said in his 1989 proposal for the web, although it might have been 1990 since the dating of this document is ambivalent, he said, quote, "There seems to be a general consensus about the abstract data model which a hypertext system should use." So Tim felt he was implementing a general consensus. Well, he didn't ask my team what it should do. Now, the World Wide Web, I think, was really created by Mark Andreessen with with the web browser. The web browser was done by Mark Andreessen at the University of Illinois, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, and that essentially was Microsoft Word on the net. And that gave you pictures and text and fonts all in one package and created essentially a universal puppet theater using Tim Berners-Lee's system of the URL, or essentially addressability throughout the world, and extended the addressability beyond domain names so you could have any number of these puppet theaters. So that's the origin of the web, which most people don't understand. But anyway, that's how we got to the present sad state of affairs. Now, I'm not going to tell you my sad stories. I believe it would be a very different world today. Not just a different computer world, but a different world if I had gotten leverage, but like many others, I did not. The Xanadu project came close to having the first word processor in 1972. We came close to having worldwide hypertext in 1988. Then came the attack in Wired, depicting me as delirious and misinformed, and that set me back 15 years. Now we have this new prototype I've just shown you, which we're trying to make into a product. It's just been converted to Python to make it debuggable. Now, I'm not a programmer. I'm a producer-director of software, like Doug Engelbart and like Steve Jobs. It's a tough road to hoe, like trying to break into movies. Getting leverage is the hard part. Doug had leverage and lost it when he lost his funding and Park hired away his best people. Jobs had leverage in the early days, but lost it under Scully and went away, then came back full tilt when Scully had run the company down to zero. And Jobs once again made Apple for a time a big deal, which it still is, and for a time, the most valuable company in the world. So, talking about leverage, why do I work low budget? I have a low-budget psychology. From the beginning, from the first issue of Nothing magazine for $30, this has been my attitude: low budget and do it your way. If you really care, don't have backers. To paraphrase Vince Lombardi, creative control isn't the main thing, it's the only thing. If you have backers, they'll eventually take it away from you or turn it into something else. So if you have backers, the illusion that it's going to stay your project is only an illusion. This has been my attitude from the beginning: the low budget and do it your way approach. It's how I did Nothing in Slocum Furlough with nobody looking, and my rock musical with nobody looking over my shoulder. Now, the Palo Alto-centric view of history doesn't tell it that way. They want you to think venture capitalists are the driving force of creativity. Give me a break. On the contrary, why were Jobs and Woz, Gates and Allen, Page and Brin, even Hewlett and Packard able to do things their way? And, of course, Walter Disney and his brother Roy? Very simple. They didn't have backers. They reached profitability on their own shoestrings. So I've been trapped in prototype hell, but at least it's better than giving it all up at the beginning. After all this time, I still don't know if my team will deliver. It took 2 years to program the Xanadu space prototype you've seen. The current team has spent two years trying to fix it. It's been redone in Python, and we may have an open source version for people to work on one of these months, but don't hold your breath. Our unique graphics engine layer makes the job especially tricky. Meanwhile, you can look at it in YouTube. It's called Ted Nelson Demonstrates Xanadu Space. And meanwhile, we can release the formats that are intended to generate the documents you saw earlier. I could as well have shown you my slides from 1965, but I can't put my hands on them. However, I can offer you specific formats now that I couldn't have done in 1965. Several years ago, we said these formats would be available under the name Translit, but there's been so much going on that we couldn't stabilize them till now. So you're going to be free to use these document formats under the name Translit. I'm keeping that as a trademark. It should really be a certification mark, but that's so damn much trouble and expense. But here are the formats. Basically, the edit decision list format. So an edit decision list consists of a span pointer. Take this span of text, or later, audio or video, but we won't talk about that right now. Take this span and this span, and then overlay them with this Xanalink, and so on. The Xanalinks are not embedded. So the Xanalink format: type, and then the nset 1, which for the first part of the link, and then the nset 2, the second part of the link, and on for as many nsets. And so the Xanalink can be as big, quite big. The Xanalinks are independent. So again, you have file type Xanadoc, which tells the contents to bring in, and the Xanalinks to apply to these contents. File type Xanalink says what to connect. Pardon me, file type Xanalink says what to connect. It's a table. So the Xanalink is a table saying, but it points to content in different documents, or possibly different places in the same document. Xanalinks are freestanding and publishable separately. They are not embedded, and they are reusable by different documents and by different authors. I hope to have stuff out there for you shortly. I promise that the final version of the current Xanadu formats will be out there by the 1st of September. So if you want to program to them and call your program for viewing Xanadocs, Translit, feel free. And you'll have the generalization of every quotation connected to its source and the generalization of Xanalinks. Now, remember, on this issue of the EDL, of the Xanalink file, of the Xanadoc file, points to content, it says bring it in. What's that you say? The content might change? But you must prevent that by caching. So you see, it's a pragmatic, political, and policy issue. It's not a technical issue. except the technicalities of implementing the pragmatic political and policy decisions that you make. So you'll be able to find these formats at Xanadu.com in a directory called, in an open directory called public on the 1st of September or earlier. There are lots of possible efficiency hacks. We won't talk about those. If you want to have a compliant system and would like to identify it as such, contact me. I will not withhold permission unreasonably. This is all derived from what is now called Xanadu Green, the great version designed in 1979 in collaboration with the guys I mentioned, and stalled by the fiasco at Autodesk, which Wired framed me as having been in charge of, but we're not doing a Xanadu history today. The formats given are for connecting the content that has been cleaned of its font crap. It should be possible eventually, with much more work, to connect to the full flapping, screaming, font-riddled hierarchical formats of the World Wide Web, the HTML pages through the document object hierarchy thingy, but that is for others to do. So is this for the web, or is it something else? Because if it's something else, what is it doing at a web conference? This is a terminological issue. Now, I've hated the World Wide Web since it began for what it isn't. But how can I, in good conscience, address this meeting on web as literature? Because I'm willing to say grudgingly that our documents can be part of the World Wide Web just as PDFs can be part of the World Wide Web and audio and Flash. The term has enlarged itself beyond just HTML to those other formats. So there's no reason that the Xanadu format can't be part of the World Wide Web. And therefore the phrase web as literature can include the visibly connected flying literature that I believe in. And another format, yet another format, incompatible with HTML, can help bring together what should not have been separate. And that brings us to the final part of the title, toward a WYSIWYNK literature. WYSIWYNK. Computer users were born free, yet everywhere they are in chains. We're in a honky-tonk nightmare prison. Facebook, Google are cattle pens. The masses have given up their birthright of computer freedom for bread and circuses. Well, perhaps I'm a little biased. Till now, we have paper simulation, locking everything to simulated pressed wood pulp. You know the phrase WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. What does that mean? It means what you see is what you get when you print it out. So, this is a propaganda phrase for making you think that printout, or at least the simulation of printout, is the intended nature of electronic documents. This is propaganda foisted by John Warnock and by Chuck Simone and by Microsoft and by the World Wide Web. WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get when you print it out. There's only one way to see a document because we're imitating paper. To me, using a computer to imitate paper is idiotic, like tearing the wings off a 747 and driving it on the highway as a bus. Why not imitate Roman scrolls or obelisks or tattoos? For God's sake, we can represent all kinds of documents and all kinds of relationships. So again, our motto is WYSIWYNK. What you see is what you never could. And there can be many views, of which paper simulation could be one. Flying pages that connect in different ways, besides looking nice, allows you to see relations you can't see otherwise. And of course, you can't see everything at once, so we have to find ways to let you see as much as possible, as fast as possible. So these documents, getting this document system working is my central issue. I only want to use the workflow system I've designed, not the one imposed by Xerox PARC with the barbaric cut and paste redefined by Larry Tesler. I only want to write Xanadocs. I want to integrate all my nonfiction writings into a unified anthology with sentences transcluding to the originals. When I tried to explain that to the great humorist Douglas Adams at dinner at the Groucho Club, he said, "Oh yes, I've always thought that eventually all my sentences would be put in exactly the right order." which is pretty funny, but a misconstrual of what I was trying to get across. So, one more anecdote. Interconnection became a religious issue for me when I was 5 years old. In a defining epiphany, it was the religious experience of my life, a moment of awe and realization, which was, I believe, completely valid. So I'll read this from my autobiography, Possiplex, which you can get at lulu.com. I trailed my hand in the water as my grandfather rowed. My grandmother was in the front of the boat, wearing high heels as always. I was 4 or 5, and this was spring 1943 at the latest. We were still in Chicago. Fuzzy shapes passed underneath. I studied the water's crystal softness. The water was opening around my fingers, gently passing around them, then closing again behind. I considered the different places in the water and the connections between them, the places that at one instant were next to each other, then separated as my fingers passed. They rejoined, but no longer in the same way. How is it, I wondered, that every instant's arrangement in the water and the world can be so much the same as just before, and yet so different? How could even the best words explain this complexity? And how many relationships were there? I could not have said relationships or systems then, let alone particles or manifolds or higher level commonalities. But those were my exact concerns. My questions and confusions were always exact, and fine distinctions concerned me greatly. They still do. In this book, I will try to say exactly what I was thinking at different times, exactly, that is, in my vocabulary of now. And how, you might ask, do I remember those floating, swirling thoughts over 70 years ago? Because these are matters I have thought about ever since, in thousands of different ways, and I reconnect them even now with that early moment of floating crystalline study, rattle of oarlocks, sun twinkle on the water, my grandfather clearing his throat, the thump of oars, my grandmother clearing her throat, the thump of oars, my grandfather's earnestness, all with me as I write in the eternal now and then. This was an immense religious epiphany of awe for me, completely valid. I believe, yeah, it's true. That in a way defined the way I think and have always thought about everything since. The universe is a system of relationships which are constantly changing and yet in some ways still the same. And literature is a crucial way that we must try to represent it. Thank you.